Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today for Sensory Design and Learning Pedagogy in School Gardens with Fatima Seck. And my name is Dinah Mack, and I'm the Education Program Manager with Massachusetts Farm to School. We're really happy to have you here. Will you go to the next slide, Fatima?
Oops, let me put us in full screen.
It's a perfect day to come to a workshop on designing sensory gardens because it's so cold, and we're at that point now where we can imagine the spring that's coming and what we might all want to do in our gardens. So we're just going to wait a minute till the slide deck loads.
Is it? I can see it on my screen.
You can. I can't see it yet.
Are other folks seeing it on theirs? I can exit and come back. Maybe?
Thanks for your patience, everyone. Yeah, do you want to hit?
Let me try
one more. Oh, there it is. Oh no, that's not the presentation mode. I can see that, but let's see.
How about now? I brought it back into presentation mode. Is it on other people?
It says loading
on
my screen.
A second.
Maybe it's cold.
Yeah, right. It's ready for spring.
So if you're joining us today, you can put questions and answers in the chat or in the Q&A column. And Fatima's going to answer questions at the end.
Yes. So mine, it's showing up on my screen, and I've...
So maybe just take it out of presentation mode and we can just watch it that way.
Watch it this way? All
Yeah.
right.
So thanks everyone for coming. If you haven't been to a Mass Farm to School program, welcome. We have professional learning events throughout the year. And if you're not familiar with Mass Farm to School, we're an organization that works statewide to strengthen local farms and fisheries and promote healthy communities by increasing local food purchasing and education at schools. And there's a lot of ways you can be involved in our work. We have professional learning opportunities throughout the year, like this one. We have a lot of different networking events. We do policy work. And if you get on our mailing list, we have a Harvest of the Month program for educators and for food service directors. It's a separate program where you get a monthly newsletter. We also have just a regular newsletter of updates. And I want to say that if you are interested in coming to the Northampton area on March 22nd, we are having our 6th conference, and it's going to be focused on climate resilience and community this year. And it's going to be at Smith College on March 22nd, which is a Friday. And the Thursday before, there are going to be some different field trips throughout the area that highlight farm to school, some field trip to Ground Up Grain in Holyoke, to Arcadia to look at an early childhood farm to school program. And Northampton Public Schools is going to have an open house looking at their farm to school program. Marty's Local, and Springfield. So we're going to have some field trips on Thursday, and then we have a great conference lined up for Friday. If you are available, please register and come join it. All right, so I'm happy to have Fatima Seck with me today. And I got to watch Fatima's presentation last week, and I got to meet Fatima for the first time, and I'm so happy that I did. And Fatima started working as a farmer and school gardener after working in art museums for several years. She loves to bring an art and cultural perspective to land-based work. She's worked with young people of all ages from preschool through university and loves to teach. So if during this presentation you have questions, there'll be time at the end to get them answered. Just pop them in the Q&A. And thanks, Fatima.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. And as you mentioned, yes, last week we talked about social emotional learning in the garden, and sensory learning and social emotional learning are really related to me. If social emotional learning is more of a philosophy, I feel like sensory learning is kind of a way of doing things and a set of skills, and more like tactile physical approaches to how we can think about creating a garden environment that is both more inclusive and also has more kind of variety and options for engagement. So when we're talking about sensory learning in school gardens, we're going to do a little bit of a big picture today, starting by understanding what sensory sensitivities are, what that means, especially in the context of working with young people. We're going to talk a little bit about how garden learning benefits from what's sometimes called in schools and in classrooms, we call this sensory smart learning. I like to say sensory mindful learning. So how does garden education and school garden education benefit from sensory mindfulness? We're going to talk about crop planting for sensory diversity. As much as it's cold, chilly winter right now, spring is around the corner, and I know all of us growers are getting excited about our crop plans. And so how can we be thinking with the idea of creating a sensory mindful garden as we make decisions about what goes into our gardens this year? How to practice sensory mindfulness in our day-to-day teaching and in our kind of educational and our pedagogy, education and our pedagogy in the school garden. And also how can we empower self-advocacy around sensory learning? Because as much as educators, we are responsible for educating ourselves and informing ourselves and creating an environment where young people with sensory sensitivities can feel safe and included. We also want to teach them how they can advocate for themselves and recognize overstimulation in themselves and be able to advocate, even when an adult is not in the room, or when an adult is not in the room, or when an adult is in the room and they need someone to, they need to hold someone accountable. That's a little bit of the big picture of what we're going to do today. And I'm going to be talking about all of this based off of my experiences as the school gardener at Mel King School in South End, which is a BPS school, K through 12. So it was really all of the students who would be in the garden, the middle school, the elementary school, some of the high schoolers, but mostly they also have a transitional program for students who have graduated high school, but are benefiting from some kind of additional structure between the ages of whenever they finish high school, and I think up to age 22. So we had them out in the garden. The Mel King School Garden, everything we grow is done with the kids. So the kids are really active at every level of the garden season. We have a program in the summer. They're there in the spring, laying down the seeds and planting seedlings. And in the fall, they're harvesting seeds. And this whole year, we distribute food to the food pantry that's next door. So the image you're seeing is a student at Mel King handing some. So yeah, I think it's amaranth. So there was so we actually grew a crop called Ifo Shoko, which is like a Nigerian crop in the garden. But it looks very similar and I think also has a similar taste to Chinese amaranth. And many of the people who come to the food pantry happen to be Chinese and Cantonese women or Cantonese speaking women who live around the South End in Chinatown. So it was kind of an interesting point of cultural connection. It was not amaranth, but it did look a lot like it. But it was kind of cool to see people getting really excited about a crop from a different side of the world and feeling like it looked like one from their home. So what you're seeing there is some of the food going to food pantry guests, which is where all our food is distributed from. And so all the images you'll be seeing are photos from the Mel King School. And please feel free to just drop any questions in the chat and we can have a little bit of a discussion and conversation afterwards. So understanding sensory sensitivity, I found, and as I got introduced to the idea of sensory sensitivity, it's quite a large idea in the sense that it touches a lot of things and it's a kind of unspecific. The way I think about it and the way I understand it is about understanding that there are some students who kind of experience sensory information. That's any information related to the five senses, our kind of physical selves. They can kind of experience that with a greater intensity that can be discomforting and kind of uncomfortable or challenging in large amounts. So a texture that for somebody might feel normal, like a sweater on skin might feel really normal for someone. It might not even make a noise. To one student, it might actually be quite like a noisy, distracting event. Sensory sensitivity, I want to highlight that it's not a condition. It's not necessarily a medical condition, although sometimes it is something that comes with, forms of neurodivergence. It's also something that young people experience, when they're experiencing puberty. It can just be a part of normal child development of, integrating. So you're integrating so much into your physiology or in learning how to integrate new information. And learning all of that all at once can just have a lot of intensity for a young person. So sensory sensitivity is just about understanding that sometimes the kinds of physical experiences that we take for granted can be actually very, very noisy for some young people. I think thinking about it as noise is a helpful tool because that's really how a lot of young people experience it. It's as if something really loud is happening. A texture might just feel more loud and distracting and occupying. And that's why when a student is experiencing something like overstimulation, when a student feels really, really distracted or overwhelmed by a sensory experience, whether it's by touch or taste or sound or feel. They can then start to kind of act out. We might start to see certain behavior like non-participation. We might start to see irritability and frustration. We might start to see anger and lashing out. Or just losing words and starting to cry. A lot of this will depend a lot on who the student is as an individual, their kind of personality and their nature. It'll depend on their age. It'll depend on whether they experience whether they might be neurodivergent or have ADHD or be autistic or be somewhere on the spectrum. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to how a sensory sensitivity is communicated. But we can just be mindful of the fact that sensory sensitivity is really, really common among young people, even if they're not necessarily articulating it, or even if it's not necessarily diagnosed as part of a formal diagnosis. I think the more we step away from having to tie all sensory mindfulness to specific diagnoses, the more we can create an environment where we can practice sensory sensitivity without attaching it to any stigma, and also understanding that by being sensory mindful, we're creating an environment for more inclusion for everybody. So understanding sensory sensitivity, I think, really comes down to really slowing down and thinking about how a new experience kind of also comes with a new physical experience that can be that can be a stressor for a young person. It means really thinking about the five senses and not taking for granted a young person's ability to just process that new information. Really thinking about some experiences as being completely novelty and new, not just on a kind of intellectual level, but even integrating a new texture or feeling a new texture for the same time you're literally activating new pathways in your brain. Your mind really needs to wrap your head around a lot. And we're used to that because we are adults. So we've just been doing it for more time. But as a young person, it can be strenuous. So sensory sensitivity, and sometimes in classroom settings, especially early childhood settings, we call it, being sensory smart. But being sensory sensitive, being sensory mindful, I think is more maybe inclusive language that understands that thinking with an eye towards and teaching with an eye towards understanding sensory sensitivities isn't about doing things right or wrong, but it's kind of an attitude, a way to approach young people, a way to approach how we give them new experiences, understanding that there's no new experience that's too small to create a reaction that might look like misbehavior. Even if you're just feeling the texture of something under the plant or there's this one crop. Oh, I don't actually know what it's called, but it's a sneaky little crop that likes to hang out with butternut squash, and it makes these flowers. It's a weed, but it makes flowers that looks a lot like butternut squash flowers. I don't know if anyone has experience with that, but I have one student who was just so unsettled by the texture of those plants and just really it gave them a lot of anxiety. That's a sensory sensitivity. That's just feeling like something about the feel of it just was really uncomfortable for them. If a young person was experiencing a new experience in the form of a roller coaster, we would have a lot of compassion and be willing to kind of slowly walk them through. This is new. Your body has never experienced this before, but you are safe and you are capable of getting to the other side of it. Or we'd respect the boundary that they're setting. But sometimes when we aren't sensory mindful, we kind of will undermine the smaller experiences that also can create similar stress. So even that texture, never having felt it before. And I agree, it's like a fuzz, but not a fuzz. It's a little unsettling. Understanding this is a new experience for a young person. this is a it creates a lot of sensory overstimulation or just discomfort. And so my options are to either respect their boundary or patiently support them through kind of meeting it for the first time and slowly interacting with the texture and giving them a little bit of a big picture and helping them slow down if their emotions start to get overwhelming. So like I said, sensory mindfulness is so tied to social emotional learning. If anyone was here at last week's session, a lot of what I'm describing is things that are very much related to SEL, right? How do we understand that students are bringing a lot to this one moment at the garden? They're bringing their whole entire selves. How can we be patient as we bring young people through new experiences? And how can we respect the boundaries that they set and learn to understand when they're communicating a boundary and not just acting out? So I touched on this a little bit, but there's several benefits to sensory mindful or sensory sensitive learning. Um, One is that it expands access to the garden, right? Like I said, we can stay away from having to like over pathologize kind of sensory sensitivity and always try to relate it to a diagnosis. But it is also true that for many young people, it does create a more inclusive environment to have options and tools that are and alternatives if they have are likely to experience overstimulation or just kind of sensory overwhelm. But even, like I said, beyond students who might have specific diagnoses, we also are just talking about young people in an experience of transition in their life. I find middle schoolers are very, very prone to overstimulation, and middle schoolers are very, very prone to experiencing discomfort around, around their senses. And so when we are thinking about that as we crop plan and as we create an environment and set our goals about what an inclusive and comfortable garden is for our young people, we just make it possible for more young people to be engaged. Sensory discomfort is a big reason why young people stop participating in the garden. I'll talk a little bit about what it looks like for us to prevent that, but sometimes when a young person isn't participating but doesn't have the language to articulate that they really something about the texture of dirt under their nails is feels so uncomfortable. They might not have the language for that, right? But we can be proactive if we understand this is part of where non-participation can come from. We can be proactive, that way they can feel more willing to engage. Um, Sensory mindful learning also deepens garden integration into school culture. So both in that it makes it more welcoming to young people, it makes it more inclusive and holistic, but it also means that it creates avenues for big people like therapists and counselors to then integrate the garden into their work. If we have tools that set the garden up where a young person isn't likely to shut down because it's a site of overstimulation, that just creates more possible connections between the school garden and the rest of the school. Um, and lastly, sensory engagement. So I've talked a lot about kind of sensory overstimulation, sensory over like sensitivity that can create non-participation. But I also want to acknowledge that sensory engagement is also a really, really big part of actually creating of creating dynamic experiences in the garden, and sometimes actually a thing that a lot of young people are actually craving. So we talked a lot about play last week, and the importance of things like embodiment and movement and touch. That's all we're talking about sensory learning. We're talking about learning that includes the five senses. It isn't about saying just engaging the intellect, but really about engaging the whole body. So when we do that, when we give young people opportunities to play with dirt, to touch new things, to taste new things, to smell new scents, to use their bodies to physically move things. We had a bunch of what is it, mulch wood chips to move from one place to another, and they really enjoyed getting to use wheelbarrows and feel strong moving things from one place to another. So when we're talking about sensory mindful, oh, I forgot to say, but this is my coworker helping us bring a bunch of seedlings from UFI, who very kindly donated all of these seedlings to the Mel King School Garden. So that's who you're looking at. When we're talking about sensory learning, we're also talking about learning that involves the five senses, involves the body, which to some extent is natural in a school garden, but we can lean into it even more. And we touched on this a little bit last week, but a big question is how school gardens can help provide the thing that maybe classrooms don't belong as well in classrooms. And if sensory learning and trying to integrate more five senses learning doesn't always fit in a classroom setting, it belongs so easily and so readily in a garden where you're already surrounded by many, many scents and textures and ways to engage the five senses. Um, Sensory learning and learning that is play-based and involves all five senses, involves embodiment, is so important for young people's emotional regulation, their social emotional development, they're building their social skills. It's just good to venture inside the self, to try new things, to be supported through experiences that are uncomfortable or challenging. So in the same way that that one pesky weed that gave that one student a lot of discomfort, that is on one hand a very stressful experience for that young person. It's also a really wonderful opportunity to learn what it is to face something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Can you stretch a little bit in your discomfort? Can you experience it for a little bit longer, enough to learn something? So those are some of the benefits of sensory mindful learning, as well as the fact that it helps us to actually create and bring more diversity into our garden. So I want to touch a little bit on crop planning for sensory diversity, which is an exciting way to think about how we design our school gardens. I know for many of us, it's kind of it's a kind of a philosophical question. I feel like I've always felt like crop planning feels like setting intentions for the season. You know, do we want to lean on culture a lot and think about how much cultural diversity we can have reflected in our garden? Do we want it to be more about what's most useful in the sense that, you know, we're growing food for a food pantry. So do we really want to grow the things that are most useful for the communities that we are serving? But when we're thinking with an eye towards sensory learning, we can crop plan around thinking about what are crops that will give students opportunities to explore all five senses. And to some extent, that's any crop, right? You know, you can smell a tomato, you can touch a tomato, you can see a tomato, you can what am I missing? You can taste it and you can get all five, right? But there are some crops that are particularly exciting and particularly interesting. I think about like straw flower was amazing for touch. You know, there's something about the texture of it. They loved it was a good there's something called stimming, or which is kind of just a stimulatory activity that a young person can do. We've all seen young people do it in some way. You know, just it tends to be a kind of a small repeated activity and that they're doing with their mouth or their hands. But it can be a kind of soothing activity. It can be really it can provide emotional regulation and relief. It can just provide comfort. It can be kind of a habit. Really most kids stim in some way. And they really loved stimming on these straw flowers. There's something about it where the texture of it, especially in the fall, you know, when that was a really fun activity doing seed saving with the straw flower, because they just love the feeling of getting to rub something and see this immediate reaction of, you know, everything starting to disintegrate. And something about the sound too, they feel really dry. So also there was one student who found that was actually a little bit uncomfortable. We had to like walk them through that a little bit. But you know, straw flower is one that like touch is definitely a great it's a great way to empower a young person to experience touch in the garden. There's also things like, you know, marigolds are amazing for color or for scent. And there are, you know, fruits. We love doing raspberries for taste. So if you start thinking about your crop plan by categorizing your garden into, you know, the five different senses and how can you, what type of crops are really the best for one sense? And what's good about that and organizing your garden that way is not only that you create a ton of variety and diversity, right? So being able to walk into a garden and have experiences of where you're using your hands and your nose and your mouth and getting to, you know, engage with all these different senses is not only just an exciting experience for a young person, but you as the garden educator, if you have in your mind, you know, which crops are best for different senses, it really helps you know how to kind of organize and manage your classroom or your group. If you notice that one student tends to feel very uncomfortable or like really, let me reframe actually, or really thrives, let's say, with things that involve listening, things that really involve listening. We had this huge bed that was covered in Tulsi basil, which like grew way more than, like, I had no idea how much Tulsi basil we would get. But it had so many bees all over it. And of course, once this young person got comfortable with bees, and bees don't want to hurt us, bees are friends. And if you see a bee, be a tree. That's a fun one that we like. They love just standing near that bed because the buzz sound is actually so soothing, right? So that's also then a tool you can use to direct that young person, if they need some regulation, if they need some cooling. In your head you have the map, um, of 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 each location in the garden or each crop in the garden, and what sense it can relate to, which can help you with learning. When you're talking with elementary school students, that's a skill they're still learning, being able to identify and describe the different senses, what they are, and be able to articulate how they're experiencing the world. So we can give them the opportunity to do that through the garden. So we are creating more experiences in the garden, we think, really through the lens of sensory diversity, and more than just what will taste good. That can be sometimes something we can lean on, or what will look good. Sometimes people like to do, having all the flowers of many different colors. But when you really start to integrate, how can we integrate, like, what are interesting textures that we can grow in the garden? Like, that's part of what they loved about worms. And it's really always about the feel of the worm that was really interesting to a young person. So when we're thinking about crop planting through the lens of sensory diversity, we can help ourselves kind of manage a classroom and create options and know what the options are for young people who have different sensory needs. But we're also creating a ton of variety and diversity in our gardens, and thinking of, and creating a space that's just like really fun to be in, um, not just interesting, but really fun. And so practicing sensory mindfulness, I've talked a little bit about what that can look like. I think, a sensory mindful crop plan is part of practicing sensory mindfulness. We talked about the compassion, to just understand that when a young person, it seems really small, but they're small. It's big to them. It's really big to them. Like that texture, that feeling, that sound. It really is that overwhelming. And so having that compassion, that this is a new experience for their mind and their bodies, and how can we just support them in experiencing it. Um, but there's other things we can do. So having that understanding is really important, and having compassion about where non-participation is coming from. I think sometimes non-participation, depending on what environment, we're teaching and learning in, can be met in different ways. But understanding that sometimes, especially in a garden, which is actually it is by nature a kind of an overstimulating space, right? It's bright, it's full of information. There's butterflies, there's bees, there's noises. You're outside, so you're also, depending on where you're gardening and learning, there's trucks and fire. What's it called? Uh, uh, fire hydrants. On the trucks. We know what we're talking. You know what I'm talking about. There's police cars and sirens. So it's just busy. There's a lot going on. So having kind of grace to young people when this non-participation can happen, particularly because students don't always even know how to articulate that what they're experiencing is overstimulation, which I'll get to in a little bit. Some specific tools that are really helpful, having gloves on hand is really awesome. So these young people, they like to touch things sometimes, but there's some who just like, really, the texture of dirt is just like a no-go. I know sometimes there can be this like desire to get young people really comfortable with like touching and experiencing the land, but for some people that's just a boundary. So wherever we can have gloves and as many tools as possible, but also giving them like fidgets. If it's not your preference to have like actual fidget toys, like I said, there are some crops that function as amazing fidget toys, like straw flower, or even like things that grow in like seed pods. If you have enough beans to spare, that's like an amazing thing to just be able to open it and pop, 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 pop. They will really enjoy doing that. So you can actually grow your own like fidget toys in the garden. I'm getting creative with what crops you decide to grow. Also key is really just giving young people choices. I think that as soon as we can set ourselves up to fail a lot when it comes to trying to create inclusion, when we only give them one option of how to participate. So really creating a lot of options, and you don't know where a young person's no is coming from. So I think just when we give them choices, we're having compassion towards, the no might just be, it could be just being a little grouchy, and you could be less grouchy and do the activity, but it could be something a lot deeper than that. And so we really want to respect those boundaries. And I think creating an environment where there's lots and lots of choices, is also about respecting young people's boundaries. That's some, is it summer squash and cucumbers that we grew in the garden. And some next to them is beds. There's beds that have buena mulata peppers in it. This season was really, or last season was really focused on cultural and heritage crops. And these buena mulata peppers were grown by Horace Pippin, who was like this amazing painter in the 40s and 50s who like traded these seeds to get bee sting therapy after he got shot in World War I. And I guess True Love Seeds has been holding on to those heritage seeds for I guess, many generations now. So last is empowering self-advocacy, because like I said, there's our responsibility as educators, but like, of course, the greatest responsibility is for them to be able to ultimately advocate for themselves and, and lead themselves into their lives. And sensory stress is very difficult because it's not always something a young person can articulate, that's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling overstimulated. I'm feeling overwhelmed. That's not always something a young person can articulate or is even like in a mental space where they can find that language. And also sometimes we might not know as educators where a young person is coming from. So it's our responsibility to model and offer language tools and alternatives for how to advocate for yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed, and that means modeling when you're feeling, or sometimes when it's really hot, I'll just be like, I'm feeling really hot right now. I'm going to go stand in the shade. Little things like that can just show a young person how to, the kind of how to express and communicate through the cause and effect of experiencing discomfort, feeling discomfort, and wanting to do something about it. But in a way that's maybe more productive and sometimes not productive, but maybe generative than how a young person can impulsively behave, because they're still learning how to do these things. So really offering up language, or if we notice a young person is feeling a little bit uncomfortable with something, just holding them in great compassion, offering them, words if they can't find them, that way they can either repeat after you or just have heard you say it. That way, the next time, even if it's not the immediate next time, we're just trying to plant those seeds, they can know how to advocate for themselves and on their behalf. Like I said, we're really just guessing sometimes. So the more we can empower their own self-advocacy, we can just work together better in our relationships with our students. So, and also, cultivating an environment of understanding, just having a lot of compassion towards young people and their sensory sensitivities and where they might come from, but also co-working as much as possible. So I think that wherever we can, if we really just seize any opportunity to bring young people into the garden and have them be a part of the work at every level, it just introduces them to the kind of textures and sensory experiences they're going to get in the garden more often. And I think the more often that they're out there, the less that we see, the shock of like coming out, once a week or once every 2 weeks. And it's just this extremely overwhelming space. I want us to remember that what we experience is this like deeply beautiful, exciting space is the garden, where there's light and it's bright and it's sunny and it's noisy, and there's the sound of the birds and there's the bees and the butterflies, and there's so many different flowers and plants, and there's life everywhere. That is so beautiful and incredible, but to a young person, it can actually be very, very overwhelming, especially in the stark contrast of a classroom, which might not just look that much and might not have that much information. I think that's also where having a slow start to getting into the garden, sometimes it can help to just throw ourselves right in, but just giving them a second to just transition a little bit can also help with just creating a softer transition between two very, very different sensory experiences and sensory environments. So that's a little bit about sensory learning in the garden. I think when it comes down to it, it's about really understanding how the garden really represents a different kind of learning than we see in classroom. It's not intellectual in the same way. It is by nature, sensory learning. It is by nature learning that has a lot of physical information, and that can create both possibilities for incredible social emotional learning and play and movement and deeper integration of ideas, and also a lot of stress and overwhelm. So as the gardeners, it's our responsibility to be in the middle, managing as well as possible. That way we can have the best of this side and manage what's on this side, and over time empower the young people with language to be able to advocate for themselves when things get overwhelming in a garden. So thank you so much. I would love to really welcome any questions or thoughts or ideas or things that you all have tried and experienced in your gardens. And thank you so much today.
Uh, Fatima, there's a question in the chat that says, can you give an example or explain a bit of the difference between lashing out irritation versus boundary setting? Also between ages. Super important to know the difference. Also, do you have a standard way of setting expectations about the sensory experience that students can expect?
Yeah, I'll start with the first question. I would say that very often the line between lashing out and setting boundaries, it's it's also, I would say that in the young person, it's the same thing. Often a young person lashing out is their attempt to set a boundary, but for whatever reason, they either feel too defensive to be able to express that in a way that's more kind, or they don't have the tools, they don't know how to, or they're too overwhelmed to be able to first regulate themselves and then can then communicate their boundary before when they're not in the heat of things and then lashing out. So I because I do treat even lashing out as a boundary, but that doesn't mean that the lashing out isn't held accountable. And that's a very difficult line to balance. And of course, it's very different when you're talking about different ages. A 3-year-old who says, just leave me alone I'm going to respond to that and I used to work with preschoolers, that's very different than when a middle schooler will say that to me or a high schooler will say that to me. There will be different expectations. The way I tend to manage that is that I actually will usually give them the alone time for a little bit because you probably do need to cool down. But afterwards, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like, how else you can express that to me. I think I usually find it's just never productive to try to have a conversation when a student is really dysregulated and frustrated. And I think that I try to treat it as a boundary, but the way I think about it is you need to learn how to set this boundary better. You are completely entitled to this boundary, but you're not entitled to the way that you're asking for it right now. And as you change in age groups, how you have that conversation changes over time. I would say the younger they are, the more likely I am, kind of the less time I give them, I guess, I think like with a 3-year-old, my preschoolers, I'm more likely to do a countdown myself. Like, okay, you need some time alone. I'm going to do a 10, 9, 8. We're going to go all the way down. And then we're going to talk about this. How do we use our words through something like this? With a middle schooler, it's going to be, you have 5 minutes and then I'm going to combine you or you can combine me. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on. We're going to talk about how we need to make this work because this will not work. So we can also set boundaries as we respect theirs, and I think as a young person starts to trust you as a collaborator and someone who's just earnestly invested in, like, I'm not saying you have to want to do things all the time. Like, you can be having a bad day and need a little bit of space, right? But I need you to know how to ask for it. So, and like I said, as you go from different age groups, how you do that is a little bit different. But I do think of them, to get back to your question, I do think of them as the same thing. But I think when a student lashes out, instead of explicitly communicating that they need a boundary or that they need some space, for me, that's about a lack of skill. That's a skill they still need to learn. How do you set a boundary with care and with respect? And then to your second question, let me see, is it written? Because I forgot.
I can read it out loud because it got moved. Do you have a standard way of setting expectations about the sensory experience? And then, so that was the second part of the question.
Yeah. I like to preface things. Like, I don't think things need to be a surprise. Like, things will already be interesting, right? So, I think about this when for anytime we're really going to do anything new, I kind of will, or I can think about an example that actually took place outside of a garden where we brought some of the herbs indoors to make fresh lemonade with herbs. And, I had to turn off the lights for some reason, but, before turning off the lights, it was very, okay, I'm about to turn off the lights. When I do that, what do we need to say? Or what do we not need to say? Do we need to scream? No, kind of giving them a little bit of an introduction about what's going to happen, what they can expect. That way, they're not kind of reacting from a place of shock first, and also addressing and giving them some permission to have a little bit of surprise, but not to kind of just seize surprise as a moment to just like lose all ability to kind of control and manage their own behavior. So I really like to preface things. I don't love things to be a surprise. I don't think they really need to. I think that we can really just communicate what's going to happen and it'll still be really interesting and dynamic to a young person. I also always like to communicate that like not everyone's gonna like something. I try to hold young people accountable to trying new things if they said they're going to. I try to hold them accountable to things that they say they're gonna do, but I'm also not there to like force anyone to do anything at the end of the day. So I think communicating what's coming and what we're going to do and what it feels like, talking about things first, and also letting people step out. But if they have an interest, to kind of step back in, so kind of holding them through that. Um, and really, that's kind of the best. That's what I have. I think when it comes to like the big picture of like the difference in a garden and the classroom and like kind of managing that shock or that difference, that's where it's kind of making good use of those early times in spring can actually be really helpful. As much as spring can be, it's cold. No, not a lot of the kids don't love being in the garden in March when it's kind of cold and chilly, but it can actually be a way to get them familiar with the space before it's just completely overwhelming and like filled with life, which is, like we said, both very, very beautiful, but can also be very overstimulating. So having them see the garden slowly change over time can allow them to integrate some of the information a little bit more slowly. That way it's not like they, have been indoors all winter and then in June they finally get to come out and it's really, really intense and overwhelming. I think having them spend as much time in the garden as possible as they slowly meet new experiences, that can help with integration. And I also find that the more a young person can be more open to a new experience if they have been a part of it for a long time. So, it might be really overwhelming I wonder how that young person who really didn't like the what is it, the weed and the squash plant. I wonder how they would have felt about it if they had planted that seed themselves, and they had seen it grow from seedling into that. So they might have felt very differently about it. So, yeah, introducing what's going to happen, no surprises. Not a big fan of surprises in a learning context like that. Giving people permission to step back and step out as much as possible, but being very boundaried about what boundaries are okay, or like what's an okay way to set a boundary. And lastly, giving them time in the garden to like watch it change over time. That way they don't experience the shock of this very intense, colorful, bright space.
I love those ideas, Fatima. Okay, another question. Um, do you have any websites with resources for designing sensory gardens?
Oh.
And if there are any, we could put some on the slide deck because we're going to be sending out the slide deck. But are there any resources that you use, or is this just from your own knowledge that you've gained?
Yeah, these are from my experiences. I can think of like kind of resources for designing sensory classrooms and like sensory mindful classrooms, and that's where a lot of I've gotten my ideas from. So I can find some of those resources and put those in the slide deck for sure.
Oh, great. Thank you. So there is a slide that says additional resources. So we'll make sure there's a couple of resources. So thank you for that question. And you got a thank you from Caroline for your last response. And then you have a question. Hi, Molly. Yes to all of this. Do you also front load that the garden is a space where it's okay to step out, take a break if they need it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very we talked about this a little bit with the last workshop on social emotional learning, but it's not a classroom, it's not a classroom. So we can kind of lean into behavior and options that aren't available in a classroom in the garden. And so really letting them know, I don't always lead with you can step out whenever you want to or step back whenever you want to, especially with middle schoolers, because some of them will really lean into that. But I will, but the culture is there. And when I see that there's a need for that, I will either proactively offer it to them, like, do you want to take 5 minutes or do you want to step? Sometimes I have like specific tasks that are kind of by yourself and you can just go take care of them. Or if a student asks for it or is behaving like they need it, I'll just give it to them. So I don't always in some environments, we had a paid program and I did let them know that, if you need to take a 5 minute, if you feel like you need to cool down and you need 5 minutes, I will give it to you. So just ask for it. But there was still a boundary that they needed to ask for it and they needed to explicitly ask for it. So they can't just disappear whenever they want to. So, yes, the culture is definitely there. I don't always lead with it, but when I am explicit about it, I set really specific boundaries around how they have to ask for time to step back or make the choice to not participate.
Thank you. Other questions or thoughts people want to share? You can put them in the chat. I can also turn on if you want to, if you're in the audience and you want to ask a question, you can let us know and I can give you microphone permission too. I love your analogy, Fatima, to the roller coaster. I think that was really, it was really visual for me. Right, we have an expectation that roller coasters will be really intense, right? And so to put that lens on that, like that something we think of as like a garden that's full of life, like everyone should just be open to this and like, you know, it's what's expected. Is it's so interesting to have a different lens to look at that. And I love that analogy to a roller coaster, which we just as a given, like of course you're going to have a reaction to that.
Right, right,
That's a
right.
really,
Oh, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
When honestly, a garden might be more like a student might have experienced roller coasters and an amusement park before they experience a garden, especially young people in the city who like really don't have access to land and green space, you know, like this really is might be more novelty, you know, than a roller coaster. So we should really, really treat it like that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting reminder and lens and visual. Do other people have any questions or thoughts they want to share? This is such a rich topic. While you were speaking, I thought, "Ah, I'm going to have to interview you and do an audio kind of podcast about this because for people who couldn't be here, there's so much to talk about.
There is.
And I loved your ideas of making fidget toys from the garden is so interesting.
There's so much to play with. I think that's also the fun. There's so much you know, a garden doesn't have the same responsibility as, you know, something that's really it's there for exploration and discovery. So you could have a whole bed that we talked about the empty last week. We have an empty bed for where we just have dirt soil in it so that the kids can just play. But you know, you could also have a full like a full bed full of some crop, but the only thing you need to do in there is play. You know, I think some kids also really love, oh my gosh, a stimming activity they love is plucking marigolds off the heads, which is sucked a little bit when like we want to give the marigolds away or, you know, we want them for pollinators. But, you know, if we had an explicit marigold bush or a marigold bed, you know, they could do that all day and they just come back. So absolutely, we can grow places for them to just play, and they don't need to make sure everything is well taken care of.
That's so liberating. Molly wrote, just want to honor how important it is that we see kids and adults when they are having these experiences. And for a long time, these experiences were ignored or not believed by the adults. And that leads to real and long-term harm.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for acknowledging that. It really does it. It creates harm in themselves. It creates their own, it makes it difficult for them to trust themselves. You know, when they're saying that they're experiencing something and an adult is denying it, it can just feel so kind of dehumanizing to just not be heard and to not be respected for what you know about yourself. So absolutely, I think there's something really, you know, restorative about taking seriously when a young person advocates for themselves. And we're talking about, you know, empowering self-advocacy. It's worth it to just, I think sometimes we can have a little bit of suspicion towards young people or that's like a whole thing to, you know, to unpack but it's worth it actually to just like, you know, you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed out, censored, like it's worth it actually, you know, and if 1 in 5 students is maybe using that in a way that they is maybe breaching that honesty a little bit, like it's worth it for the other 4, you know, so absolutely, I love that you raised that because it's very, very important.
Anyone else have anything they want to add or ask while we have Fatima here? Well, we really appreciate everyone who's joined us today. Whatever you have, whatever position you have, I know it takes a lot of time at the end of the day to come to a webinar, and we really appreciate Mass Farm to School does your participation. If there's topics that you really want us to cover, like by all means, please send us an email or send me an email. My email should be on the slide deck, but I'll make sure it is. And we will be sending the slide deck and the recording out to all of you, and feel free to share it as well with anyone who you think would benefit. And we appreciate it. And Fatima, thank you so much for giving your time to this event and sharing your knowledge. this week and last week. If you missed last week's, all of our webinars are on our website. So you can see all the webinars for years on there. And so Fatima's talk last week will be on there. And it was social emotional learning in the school garden was the title. So thank you all for coming. And Fatima, thank you so much for taking time to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, everyone, for yours today.